No one talks about the moment a man like Keanu Reeves realizes he trusted the wrong person. Not the headlines, not the launches, not the billion-dollar decisions, but that quiet, almost invisible second when something inside him shifts, and he knows without proof yet that something isn't right. It didn't start with a mistake, it started with trust. Because when Keanu gave her that one responsibility, it wasn't just another task or another role in a company filled with brilliant minds and impossible deadlines. It was something he rarely gave anyone: control. For a man who built his life on precision and calculated risks, seeing 10 steps ahead when no one else could, that decision meant more than anyone realized. At first, everything seemed exactly how it should be. She was sharp, focused, calm under pressure, the kind of person who didn't need constant direction, who could take an idea and carry it further than expected. That's what made her stand out. That's what made Keanu notice. In a world where most people tried to keep up with him, she moved differently, not faster, not louder, just aligned, almost too aligned. There was a moment, small and forgettable to anyone else, when he first handed over that responsibility. No long speech, no dramatic build-up, just a quiet decision. This is yours now. Simple words, but behind them was something heavier, because Keanu doesn't delegate lightly. He observes, he studies, he tests. By the time he trusts you, you've already passed more invisible evaluations than you'll ever know. That's why when things began to shift, it didn't make sense. At first, nothing obvious, no sudden failure, just subtle changes. A delay here, a detail slightly off there, the kind of inconsistencies most people overlook. But Keanu wasn't most people. He noticed patterns. Patterns to him were never random. Still, he said nothing, because there's a difference between suspicion and certainty. Keanu Reeves doesn't move on suspicion alone, not when stakes are high, not when trust is involved. If you've ever been drawn into a story where everything seems perfect until it quietly isn't, stay with it, because what unfolded next wasn't just unexpected. It would change how he saw people completely. Days turned into weeks, and the project she was responsible for continued moving forward. On the surface, everything looked intact. Progress reports came in, updates were delivered, numbers, metrics, timelines, all in place. From the outside, you'd think everything was under control, exactly as planned. But there was a feeling Keanu couldn't ignore, not fear, not doubt, something quieter, harder to explain. It was the kind of instinct that doesn't shout, it lingers. The more he tried to dismiss it, the more it stayed. One report in particular stood out, perfectly structured, every detail accounted for, every outcome aligned. Too aligned, because real progress, real innovation is messy. There are setbacks, friction, resistance, but this was clean, unnaturally clean. That's when the thought first crossed his mind. Not fully formed, not something he would say out loud, just a passing realization that refused to leave. Something wasn't being shown, not hidden in an obvious way, but withheld. The strange part was that he had chosen her because she didn't feel like someone who would do that. That's what made it different. That's what made it dangerous. When trust breaks in obvious ways, it's easier to handle. You see it, you react. But when it shifts slowly, quietly, you don't realize what you've lost until it's already gone. Keanu was getting closer to that realization, closer than he knew. There was one more detail, small enough to ignore but precise enough to matter, that would begin to connect everything. When it did, he wouldn't just question the project, he would question her, and more importantly, he would question why he trusted her in the first place. The first real crack didn't look like a problem, it looked like progress. That was the unsettling part. Inside the fast-moving world surrounding Keanu Reeves, progress usually came with noise. Late nights, last-minute pivots, problems solved under pressure. It had texture, friction, but this project moved like glass, smooth, controlled, almost untouched by chaos. At first, Keanu allowed it because sometimes rare people do exist, the kind who bring order where others bring confusion. For a while, he let himself believe she was one of them, but belief has a limit, and his limit was approaching. It started with something small, a timeline adjustment, not unusual on its own. Delays were expected, but this one came wrapped in perfect reasoning, delivered with quiet confidence, supported by data that left no room for argument. Too perfect. Keanu read it once, then again, then a third time. Every explanation held, every number aligned, but something beneath it felt constructed, not false, just arranged. He didn't confront her, not yet, because Keanu understands something most people don't. The truth reveals itself faster when you don't chase it. Instead, he watched. He let the process continue. He allowed the updates, the reports, the steady rhythm of progress to play out exactly as she presented it. For a moment, everything held together until it didn't. There was a meeting, routine on the surface, a small group, focused, efficient. She spoke clearly, confidently, walking through each phase as if nothing had ever been uncertain. That's when it happened. A detail, brief, almost invisible. But it didn't match. Not in a way that would alarm anyone else, but to Keanu, it stood out immediately. He remembered everything, every version, every iteration. This wasn't consistent. He didn't interrupt or react. He simply noted it, stored it, and let the meeting continue. But something had shifted. This wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a pattern, and patterns don't lie. Later that night, long after conversations had ended and the room had emptied, Keanu went back through everything. Every report, every update, every small detail most people would never think to question. Slowly, something began to emerge. Not a clear answer or a direct mistake, but a subtle misalignment that repeated itself just enough to matter. It was like looking at a reflection that almost matched reality, but not quite. The more he looked, the clearer it became that this wasn't accidental. Randomness doesn't repeat this cleanly. There was intention here, carefully hidden, carefully maintained. Suddenly, the project itself wasn't the focus anymore. She was. The way she spoke, the way she explained things, the way every answer seemed prepared but never rehearsed enough to raise suspicion. It was precise, controlled, deliberate. For the first time, Keanu considered something he hadn't allowed himself to think before. What if this wasn't about performance? What if this was about perception? The idea didn't sit comfortably, because it meant the trust he had given so freely, so confidently, was being managed, not respected. There's a difference, and that difference changes everything. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the more perfect something looks, the harder it becomes to believe it? That quiet discomfort that doesn't go away even when everything checks out on paper, that was where Keanu was now, standing between logic and instinct. Instinct was starting to win. Still, he didn't act, not yet. One inconsistency isn't enough. Even a pattern needs confirmation. But confirmation was coming closer than he realized. There was one more layer to uncover, one more detail that would connect everything in a way he couldn't ignore. When it surfaced, it wouldn't just raise questions, it would force a decision that would test not just her honesty, but his ability to trust his own judgment. If he was right, then this was never just about a job. If he was wrong, then he was about to break something that might not be repairable. By the time Keanu Reeves reached that point, it wasn't doubt anymore. It was awareness, the kind that builds quietly, piece by piece, until ignoring it feels more dangerous than confronting it. He stopped looking at the project as a whole. Instead, he focused on fragments, small sections, isolated details, moments that alone seemed insignificant but together formed something far more precise. The more he narrowed his focus, the more the illusion began to thin. There were inconsistencies in how progress was measured, subtle shifts in language across reports, numbers that aligned but didn't develop the way real data should. It wasn't wrong. That's what made it difficult. It was adjusted carefully, intentionally, as if someone wasn't trying to fabricate reality, but reshape how it was seen. Keanu leaned back, staring at the screen longer than usual. Not reacting, not rushing to conclusions, because he understood the weight of what he was beginning to see. This wasn't a simple error or carelessness. Carelessness leaves gaps. This had none, which meant one thing: it was controlled. Control in the wrong hands is never accidental. Still, something didn't add up. If she had gone this far, if she had maintained this level of precision, why leave anything at all? Why allow even the smallest inconsistency to exist? That question stayed with him because people who construct something like this don't slip, unless they believe no one is looking close enough. That thought changed everything because it meant this wasn't just about execution, it was about confidence. Confidence that the system would hold, confidence that trust wouldn't be questioned, confidence in him. That's when Keanu realized something uncomfortable. She hadn't just taken responsibility, she had taken advantage of it. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a way that depended entirely on his belief in her. That belief had become the foundation, and now that foundation was shifting. He stood up, walking slowly across the room, replaying everything in his mind, every conversation, every moment he had chosen to trust instead of verify. One memory stood out more than the rest, a conversation that at the time felt ordinary, but now felt different. She had said something simple, easy to overlook, but in hindsight it carried a weight he hadn't noticed before. Not a lie, not even a contradiction, just a statement delivered with a certainty that didn't need to be there. Certainty, when it appears too cleanly and too consistently, often hides something underneath. Keanu stopped. That was it. It wasn't just the data or the reports. It was the tone, the control, the way uncertainty had been removed from every part of the process. But real work, real innovation, doesn't eliminate uncertainty. It moves through it. What he was seeing wasn't just progress. It was presentation, carefully managed and delivered. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether something was wrong. It was how long it had been happening. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity, because anger clouds judgment, and Keanu needed precision now more than ever. He returned to his desk and opened the files again. But this time, he wasn't looking for inconsistencies. He was looking for intention. Once you start looking for intention, everything changes. Patterns sharpen, details connect, and what once felt subtle becomes impossible to ignore. There it was, a sequence, a repeating adjustment that aligned too perfectly with key milestones. Not random, not reactive, but strategic. That's when the full weight landed. This wasn't someone trying to maintain control. This was someone shaping outcomes, not by altering reality completely, but by guiding how it appeared. That's far more dangerous because it doesn't break trust instantly. It erodes it slowly, quietly, until there's nothing left to stand on. Keanu exhaled slowly, not surprised anymore, just aware. With that awareness came a decision waiting to be made. Once you see something like this, you can't go back. You can't pretend it isn't there. You can't ignore it. But acting on it comes with consequences, not just for her, but for everything built around that trust. The next step he was about to take wouldn't just expose the truth. It would reveal something even more difficult to face, something he hadn't fully considered yet. If she had been this careful and deliberate, there was a reason behind it, a reason he hadn't uncovered. But he was about to. When he did, it wouldn't just explain what she had done, it would explain why. That why would be far more unsettling than the truth itself. By now, the situation had moved beyond analysis. For Keanu Reeves, it was no longer about discovering if something was wrong. It was about understanding why it was done this way. Intention always leaves a signature, and he was starting to see it, not in one place, but across everything. He stopped approaching it like a flaw. Instead, he treated it like a system designed not to break, but to redirect. When he looked at it from that perspective, the structure became clearer. Every report didn't just inform, it guided. Every update didn't just reflect progress, it shaped perception. It was subtle, almost invisible, but consistent enough to matter. The deeper he went, the more it revealed something he hadn't expected. This wasn't chaotic manipulation. It was disciplined, calculated, maintained over time. It wasn't reactive, it was planned. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought something sharper, disappointment. Trust, once given, isn't something Keanu offers lightly. It's built over observation, patterns, and time. Now those same patterns were being used against him. He walked through the timeline again, not as a sequence of events, but as a progression of control. There it was, the turning point. A moment buried in weeks of steady updates where the project shifted direction slightly, just enough to matter but not enough to raise concern. At the time, it had seemed like optimization. Now it felt intentional because that shift created something important: dependence. After that point, every step forward relied on the structure she controlled. Every metric, checkpoint, and reported success flowed through her. That meant one thing: she didn't just manage the task, she managed the narrative. That's when it became clear. This wasn't about hiding failure, it was about owning the outcome completely. When someone controls both the work and how it's perceived, they control reality itself. Keanu paused at that thought because it explained something deeper he hadn't fully admitted until now. He hadn't just trusted her ability, he had trusted her perspective. That's a different kind of trust entirely. Ability can be measured, tested, verified, but perspective is personal. That's where judgment lies. Once you rely on someone else's interpretation of reality, you're no longer fully in control of it. That realization settled heavily, not because of what she had done, but because of what he had allowed. There was a moment, brief but undeniable, where he saw the full picture, not just the inconsistencies or the pattern, but the design behind it. It was precise, too precise to be accidental. She had built something that could survive scrutiny, hold under pressure, and not collapse when questioned because it had already accounted for that. That's what made it dangerous. The more stable it looked, the harder it became to challenge without disrupting everything around it. Still, one piece was missing: the reason. People don't maintain something like this without a purpose, not over this amount of time, not with this level of control. There had to be a point where it started, a decision, a moment where she chose this path instead of another. Keanu needed to find it, not for confirmation, but for clarity. He went back further before the reports became perfect, before the system fully formed, back to the earlier stages where things were still natural and unrefined. There it was, a subtle shift in tone, a change in how she communicated, barely noticeable unless you knew what came after, but now it stood out. It marked the beginning, not of the outcome, but of the intention. That changed everything because it meant this wasn't something that happened over time. It was something that started with a decision, a deliberate one. Keanu sat still for a long moment, not reacting, just absorbing it. Once intention is clear, everything else follows. Now he understood the structure and the execution, but the reason still lingered, unanswered and unresolved. That was the most important part, because without the reason, the truth was incomplete. He could confront her now. He had more than enough, but something held him back. Not hesitation or uncertainty, but something more calculated. Exposing what she did would reveal the outcome, but waiting might reveal something deeper, something she didn't expect him to see. That's what he wanted, not just the truth, but the truth behind it. Whatever had driven her to build this was still there, still active, still shaping what would happen next. Keanu was about to step into that moment, the one where everything surfaces, not slowly or subtly, but all at once. When it does, it doesn't just expose actions, it exposes motives. Motives are far harder to face. By the time Keanu Reeves reached that point, the situation had already crossed an invisible line. It was no longer about discovery, it was about timing. The truth was there now, clear, structured, undeniable, but truth revealed at the wrong moment can collapse more than it fixes. Keanu understood that better than anyone, so he didn't confront her, not immediately. Instead, he did something far more deliberate. He created space, not distance, but space. The kind that allows things to move without interference but under observation. He let the system continue, let the updates come in, let the process unfold exactly as she designed it. Systems like this don't stop on their own. They expand. Expansion reveals pressure points. That's what he was waiting for, the moment where control stretches just far enough that it exposes itself. It didn't take long. Another update came through, polished, consistent, aligned, just like the others. But this time, there was something different, a small addition, an adjustment that wasn't necessary, at least not yet. That's what made it stand out. Unnecessary changes don't come from stability. They come from anticipation. She wasn't just maintaining the system anymore, she was reinforcing it, strengthening it before it could be questioned. That meant one thing. She knew. Not everything, but enough. Enough to sense that something was shifting, enough to start protecting what she had built. Keanu read the report carefully, then again. Then he did something he hadn't done until now. He compared it against a version she didn't expect him to revisit, an earlier phase before the system fully took shape. That's when the difference became undeniable. Not dramatic or obvious, but precise. A single variable adjusted in a way that aligned perfectly with the narrative she had been maintaining. It wasn't an error, it was a correction. But not a correction of reality, a correction of perception. That confirmed everything. This wasn't reactive behavior, it was controlled evolution. She wasn't responding to problems. She was managing how they were seen before they could become problems. That level of awareness doesn't happen by accident. It requires attention, focus, intent. Now there was no doubt left, but still, Keanu waited because confrontation would end it, and ending it too early meant losing something valuable. Not the project or the outcome, but the full picture. There was still one piece missing, the moment of exposure, not the kind he initiated, but the kind she revealed herself. That's what he needed, because people can defend against accusations, but they can't defend against their own patterns. So he introduced something subtle, a shift small enough to go unnoticed by most, but significant enough to test the system she had built. A change in direction, not drastic, just enough to disrupt the flow she controlled. Then he watched. For a moment, nothing happened. The system held. The updates continued. Everything appeared stable, exactly as before. But then there it was, a response. Not in words, not directly, but in the structure of the next update. She adjusted quickly, too quickly, aligning everything with the new direction without acknowledging the shift itself. That was the moment. Real systems need time to adapt. They show friction, they reveal transition, but this was seamless, unnaturally seamless. The adjustment wasn't organic, it was protective. She wasn't following the system anymore, she was guarding it. In doing so, she exposed it completely. Keanu leaned back slowly. No frustration, No reaction, just clarity. Everything connected, the pattern, the control, the intention. Finally, the reason began to surface. Not fully, not in words, but in behavior. This wasn't about failure or avoiding mistakes. It was about ownership, control over the narrative, control over the outcome, control over how everyone perceived reality. That kind of control doesn't come from insecurity alone. It comes from something deeper, something more personal, something that hadn't been revealed yet. It was close now, closer than ever. Once someone begins protecting a system instead of executing it, they're no longer focused on the work. They're focused on what happens if it's exposed. That's where everything changes, because fear, when it reaches that level, forces a decision. Not later, not eventually, but soon. Keanu could feel the shift, the moment approaching, the one where everything would come to the surface. Not gradually, not quietly, but all at once. When it did, it wouldn't just confirm what she had done. It would reveal something far more difficult to process, something he hadn't fully prepared for. Because the truth, when it finally arrives, doesn't always hurt because of the action. Sometimes it hurts because of the reason behind it. By now, everything had built to a point where waiting was no longer a strategy. It was a test of patience, endurance, and observation. Keanu Reeves had seen patterns before in technology, markets, and teams, but nothing like this. This was human behavior intertwined with systems, calculated yet instinctive, predictable yet impossible to fully anticipate. Keanu reviewed every interaction she had with the project, every adjustment, optimization, and carefully designed element. As he traced each step, he realized something profound. The system itself had become a reflection of her mindset. It wasn't just a project anymore, it was a map of priorities, choices, and most revealingly, of how she managed control. Control. That single word carried weight. In technology, control is measurable. In people, it is not. Watching her carefully orchestrate every update, Keanu began to see the line between competence and overcompensation blur. She wasn't failing, she was protecting herself. Every tweak and calculated move was meant to safeguard a version of reality that made her indispensable, flawless, and untouchable. But there's a moment in every dynamic where even perfection becomes vulnerable. Even control has limits. Keanu could sense it creeping closer. The tension was subtle. A hesitation here, a slight overcorrection there, an update sent without acknowledgement. Almost imperceptible, but it was there. And it said everything. He remembered the first time he had noticed it weeks earlier, a small deviation in her workflow, a minor inconsistency in a report. At the time, it was easy to dismiss as human error. But now, with weeks of careful observation, he could see the pattern emerging. The errors weren't errors. They were indicators, signals of an underlying pressure he hadn't noticed until it reached this point. Keanu leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of realization settle. He wasn't angry, not really. He was intrigued because this was more than a failed task or a broken expectation. This was a revelation. The very thing that had caused heartbreak in the simplest sense. The misalignment between trust and execution had evolved into something far more revealing. Insight. Raw, unfiltered insight into how someone navigates responsibility when stakes are high. Yet insight alone doesn't soften the sting of betrayal. He had entrusted her with one job, one critical responsibility. The expectation was clear. The outcome should have been straightforward. But life, as he often reminded himself, isn't linear. People are variables. In this case, she had been both a variable and a constant, inconsistent in intention. That duality created tension that rippled through every part of the project. He thought back to the moments that had felt insignificant at the time, the delayed updates, the subtle justifications, the careful framing of her explanations. Each had seemed small, almost invisible, but in aggregate, they painted a picture that no single observation could capture. It was like watching a puzzle assemble itself, but one where some pieces had been deliberately altered. Altered not to deceive exactly, but to protect an image she wanted the world to see. Keanu recognized something crucial. It wasn't malice or rebellion. It was self-preservation elevated to a level of sophistication he hadn't anticipated. In that recognition, a strange empathy emerged. Human nature, he realized, is always a negotiation between expectation and fear, between trust and ambition. She had navigated that negotiation in her own way. Still, understanding doesn't erase consequence. Decisions have weight, actions have impact, and one misstep, even unintentional, can cascade into outcomes that ripple far beyond the original scope. Keanu knew that sooner or later the system would demand accountability. The moment would come when the pattern she had carefully constructed could no longer contain the pressure. It would surface and manifest. When it did, the results wouldn't just affect the project. They would affect trust, credibility, and the delicate balance of relationships built around shared goals. He studied the latest update one final time, his mind tracing every implication, every adjustment, safeguard, and subtle overcorrection. Then he saw it, a tiny gap, nearly imperceptible in a section she had reinforced. A single oversight, almost invisible but real. It was the human element, the imperfection that could not be eliminated no matter how much control she exercised. At that moment, clarity hit him like a jolt. The heartbreak, frustration, tension, all of it was not about failure in execution. It was about exposure. The truth she had protected herself from revealing was now visible, not in a confrontation or in words, but in the system itself. That was something no amount of skill could hide. Keanu smiled quietly, almost imperceptibly, not in triumph but in recognition. He had given her one job. She had executed it flawlessly in form, but imperfectly in spirit. That imperfection revealed the deeper story, the story of intention, control, and vulnerability intertwined. He leaned forward, eyes scanning the final lines of data, and realized this wasn't the end. It was the moment before revelation, the point where outcomes could diverge, where decisions mattered more than ever, where the smallest choice could tip the scales. In that suspended space, he understood something fundamental. Sometimes the hardest part isn't assigning blame or lamenting mistakes. It's seeing the human truth hidden behind the skill, the desire to control, the fear of exposure, the tension between expectation and reality. In that recognition, the heartbreak transformed, not into anger or defeat, but into understanding. Because now the future was wide open. One job had been broken, one heart had been tested, but the lessons it revealed would shape decisions far beyond a single project, far beyond a single interaction. That ultimately was the consequence that lingered, quiet, powerful, and indelible. Even as he prepared to act on the next step, Keanu felt the anticipation, the unresolved tension, the subtle awareness that the final truth was still waiting just beyond reach. With that, he knew the story was far from over. The revelation would come, the consequence would unfold. The lesson etched deep into every system, interaction, and choice would remain indelible. Because sometimes giving someone one job isn't about the task. It's about the story that emerges when they fail, when they succeed, and when the fragile line between the two finally breaks. That was the truth Keanu would carry forward, sharp, unrelenting, and utterly human.